Well, here, the Labour leader, Ed Miliband, has said that what he called David Cameron's silence on events in Gaza is inexplicable. He also called Israel's actions unacceptable and unjustifiable. Well, Downing Street has responded by accusing Mr Miliband of playing politics with the crisis. A little earlier, I spoke to Mr Miliband and asked him what it was he wanted the government to do.
The government needs to put pressure on both sides. Hamas is a terrible terrorist organisation. I condemn their rocket attacks on Israel and the building of the tunnels. But I think it's pretty clear that, it's pretty clear to me anyway, that Israel's actions have been both unjustified and unacceptable. I speak as a friend of Israel. I have relatives in Israel. I care deeply about the state of Israel. But I think that day by day, as we see these outrages on our television screens, Israel is losing friends in the international community.
But exactly,
quite apart from the
what
tragic
else?
Loss of life that we're seeing.
In the Prime Minister's position, what else would you do differently?
There are three things that I would be doing. First of all, I would be speaking out without timidity and truthfully about what is happening in the region and saying to both sides that the violence must stop and saying that I believe that Hamas's actions are totally disgraceful and unacceptable, but that also Israel's
David Cameron has said on many occasions there should be a ceasefire.
Secondly, well, I'm afraid that my disagreement with the government is that throughout this period they haven't come out and said that Israel's actions are unjustified. We've heard from the United States that when there was a previous attack on a school, they said it was indefensible, and I think they were right. We've heard from the UN Secretary General. We haven't heard a loud enough or clear enough view from the British government. And in a way, that's part one of what I was then going to come on to say, which is that we then need to put pressure on both sides for that ceasefire and the longer-term solution.
The government have made it quite clear that they think this is pretty shabby politics on your behalf. Chris Grayling has gone as far as to say you actually undermine the Middle East peace effort by being ultra-critical of Israel. In essence, he's saying, you're naive. The Prime Minister is using diplomatic language, and that is the only way forward.
Well, clearly that's nonsense. I mean, look, first of all, in 2006, when the Israeli incursion into Lebanon happened, the Prime Minister was actually himself saying, as leader of the opposition, that it was disproportionate and wrong. So for them now to be saying
Tony Blair for not saying the same.
Yeah, and he was actually right then. But what I'm saying to him is, well, you know, frankly, if that was his view then, I don't see how they can accuse me of playing politics now. All of my sympathy, as I say, is as a supporter of Israel, as somebody who's a friend of Israel. But when you see this happening, and I also think, if I can just make this point, I also feel this is deeply counterproductive for Israel itself. And when your friend does something which is not only wrong, but deeply counterproductive, it's right to say it, because I fear that quite far from actually leading to a reduction in support for Hamas, the danger of what Israel is doing is that with every death of every innocent Palestinian, we'll see support for Hamas grow. That is what I fear. So that's why I think the government needs to speak out much more clearly.
But what undoubtedly the Israelis would say to you, as they have said to others, if you were Prime Minister of a country which, as they would put it, is having rockets rain down on their land constantly, what would you do?
Well, I really understand the Israeli sense and feeling of insecurity. I've seen for myself some of the places those rockets are landing. And I know the deep sense of anxiety, insecurity and real fear there is in the Israeli population. And I totally understand that. But in the end, we have to make a judgment about whether these actions are really making Israel safer or less secure. And I'm afraid my judgment is that these actions aren't making Israel safer and more secure, but actually less safe and less secure.
But what would you suggest they do?
The more violence there is, well, the first thing that should happen is this ceasefire. Because until you have that ceasefire and a long-term solution to the problems in Gaza and the problems around the Palestinian people, then we're never going to end the violence. And that is what needs to happen. So I do defend Israel's right to defend itself, but I can't defend these actions.
And you think the government needs to go further?
And it's difficult to say that. I do think they need to go further, yes. I do think they need to speak out. because speaking out is necessary to then put the pressure on Israel, as of course there must also be pressure on Hamas, a terrorist organisation, to end this violence.
And just very briefly, we mentioned Tony Blair earlier on. Do you think he needs to speak out more directly against what Israel is doing?
Well, look, that's a matter for him. He's the Middle East envoy, but certainly I've given you my opinion. I know he'll be expressing his, but I'm very, very clear about my view of the situation.
The Labour leader, Ed Miliband, talking to me earlier on.